Welcome to the Lightforge. This is Adwukta.
This is Merps, and we're getting it right on the first try. If you're listening from a podcast,
there's
just
no
realize
takes.
that
This is all live, like one take, live audience.
Just realize that there are no mistakes on the Lightforge podcast. 12 wins every time, perfect recording every time.
Okay, we did get 12 wins last week.
We did.
So if you just started watching and this is only your second episode, it's been 12 wins every week.
Fantastic. If you want to see us keep up the 12-win streak, maybe you want to skip this week's. We haven't done it yet, but
you're just so down on the Warlock, aren't you? You have had the most negative feelings towards the Warlock that I have ever seen you have towards any class.
Well, for me, a lot of it these days is about fun, right? And if you watch my streams as well, like when Rogue comes up, I don't know if you know this, I don't select Rogue anymore. Not because of its power level. In fact, it's one. I don't find.
You don't think Rogue is fun? Rogue is so fun right now.
Not today's Rogue.
Like your opponent does something and you kill it.
Yeah, but it's not about it's not really about the tempo plays there. So much of it has shifted into the.
Oh, it's a control.
Right?
It's a control play.
Right.
Rogues are very control now.
No, and I've always hated that kind of rogue.
Oh,
for me, it was when did I like playing rogue the best? During the Goblin Auto Barber, the Buccaneers, right? And then I would draft double, triple Cold Blood with those small drops, right? The Undercity Valiants. And when they took it away, I was like, you know what? Rogue is still okay. I can still have fun. I can still go aggro. But then they released all the... Anyways, Rogue is not what we're talking about.
I got a 12-win Rogue last week, and it was I sprinted and won. Every game that I sprinted, it was I clearly win now.
Right, look, like I said, nothing to do with the power level.
Yeah. But no, it's a very slow kind of game where your entire game plan is denying your opponent the ability to do anything, and then you win.
Yeah, it's nothing about the power level. It's just I do not find the current version of Rogue very fun.
So you're just basically saying that your enjoyment of the game is very limited to an aggro playstyle, and when you can't do that playstyle, you can play it, you agree that it's powerful, but you're just going to avoid it as much as possible, in which case you will never ever want to play Warlock in this meta, and I totally understand.
Right. And because of that, I never like playing Warlock. So the classes I enjoy playing are Druid, obvious reasons. Hunter, for even more obvious reasons, right? I like playing Warrior, but I can't
believe you like playing Warrior. Do you just not get hit with the biggest I need Zoloft now feeling as soon as you touch the Warrior?
Zoloft? Zoloft?
Zoloft. Never mind.
Zoloft?
Never mind.
Anyways.
Move on.
Moving on from that. No, look, no matter what, because Warrior has to be aggressive. You never are able to draft or play control Warrior. So with Warrior, I just do that. I hope to get the weapons, and you roll some dice with the Molten Blade RNG, basically. I do enjoy playing Warrior, and even if I'm playing control, I don't like playing Rogue. I'd much rather play Mage because they have RNG spells, and I can herp-a-derp oh, let's see what other spell we're gonna get. With Rogue, it's just about removal, and there's not really any randomness to it as well. But like I said, we're not talking about Rogue, and we're not talking about fun today. We're talking about checklists. Yeah,
checklists. The what do you call those things? Flag bearers of fun.
Yeah, it's pretty great. So if you guys
control Warlocks, no, not fun. Checklists.
Look, I'm not going to pretend checklist is fun, but it is something that we are doing today.
Okay, so just so you know, we're going to start off talking about checklists. We're going to start off today in a different way with a question from the GOAT, because a lot of people have been asking to since the learning process, Lightforge, to actually provide a more detailed checklist. We gave one way back when, but it was kind of a and then the checklist changed with the meta a bit, and also that one was a little more cursory, and Merps wanted to go a little deeper in it. And after that, we're going to talk. We're going to have a deep fried meta about actual taunts and the mechanics in the game. So let's start off with this question from the GOAT, Merps.
All right, this is the most comprehensive question from the GOAT we will ever have, which is, Merps, what is your checklist? Or Merps, I need a checklist for a turn. So if you guys aren't aware, a checklist is basically what I said 2 weeks ago in the Lightforge. I'm like, you need to create a checklist for a turn, right? And a turn, it's basically, you know, like the entire cyclical process of what you should be thinking about and considering when your opponent is acting and when it is your turn to act as well. So we have this checklist here, and I will go through. And I decided for this one, it's going to be slightly different than the one I did like 100,000 Lightforges ago.
Which Lightforge was that, for the people who want to know?
You know what? That would be a great thing if I actually searched it up and remembered, but I do not. I do not. Do you have it since you asked it?
Well, no, because you're the one talking about it. But, I'm going to find it right now as you talk.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
So talk.
All right. So the important thing about this checklist is this is not my personal checklist. Like the one previously, I was like, no, this is how I think. I think, so this checklist that I am about to give you guys, I think is just a good general checklist. And if you guys don't have it, feel free to use this, feel free to appropriate it. I've tried, so obviously it has my thought process in it, but I think the way of thinking is going to be good for any player that wants a tangible checklist for the turn. So we're going to start off, and our starting point is going to be assuming that after your opponent makes a move, he or she automatically clicks end turn, right? So it's basically the end of their turn. Now, I know that, you know, they might do their move and then rope you because they're a jerk and emote a lot. But basically, you want to start asking these questions as soon as your opponent is done with their turn. So let's go through this, right? So your opponent just did stuff, put down cards. First question you want to ask is, what did my opponent do? Very simple question, right? You should be able to answer. But the answer that you're looking for is not like, oh, you know, the opponent Jaina played a Flame Geyser to remove, you know, my minion, and then also played a Chillwind Yeti, right? You don't just want to repeat what exactly they did. You want to sort of ask this, like, what did my opponent do, right? Did they play for tempo? Did they play for card advantage?
So,
sort of like...
Okay, so is it still a what question, or is it now a why question?
No, it's still
it's still a what question. It's like what the actual practical effects on the board that has happened. Okay, so instead of looking at looking at the micro of what exactly the cards he played did, you want to look at the macro as to what the cards he did and how it affected the status of the game as it currently stands.
Right. You want to ask sort of like, what did playing that Yeti represent, right? What did playing that Flame Geyser represent? And you guys you don't have to go super deep into it. Even just thinking about this, translating like those cards into more of a broad strokes idea will help you out in the later term. So that would be the first thing you ask. And once again, do not focus on this like so much. Like, what does the Yeti mean, man? Like, no, you don't have to double rainbow this, all right? But that's the first question. Second question, which you can, it's similar to the first one, is what did my opponent not do, right? Maybe they didn't. This is a good time to identify. They did not play AoE. They did not remove my minion, right? Especially if it's like a high priority minion that they should have removed. You know, now you want to think, what did they not do? And then you can also, it's something to just good to keep in mind. And also something that's like, well, if they didn't remove that, maybe they didn't have removal and everything.
Right. That's where you make the reads.
Right.
Like,
so now we're getting closer to the reads.
If your opponent did something, that usually means like 90% of the time that they did the thing that was the best to them, which means that they did not have anything that was better. And that usually crosses out a whole list of stuff. So if you're doing the checklist, you should always be making a checklist of what my opponents do not have. And you may think, oh yeah, you can just top deck it. So sure, your reads are not that great 4 turns from now when he's drawn 4 cards. But if you're just playing around your opponent's top deck when he has had cards he's been holding for a long time, the odds of the card being in the cards he's been holding, especially if it's like a power card, like a hard removal or like a board clear, is so much higher to be a card that he's held. Because they're all situational. Right. So you presented them with a situation that this card would be perfect for, and you didn't use it. So that means you could make a pretty safe read that he doesn't have it, and the chances of him top decking a removal, for example, even as like a mage, is like, I don't know, 2 out of 30 or something, right? Like it's a ridiculously small percentage.
So I don't want to talk about reads too much right now because there's a funneling thought process, all right, and we will get to reads in a second. So the third question you want to ask after what did my opponent do, what did my opponent not do, is what is my opponent's game plan? And there are even 2 sub-questions for this. So the first one is sort of, what is my opponent's game plan for this turn? Like this turn that my opponent just did, right? If a shaman, for example, after turn 5 does something really weird and, you know, like very hesitant, not playing a lot, is like, oh, is my opponent's game plan setting up a volcano, right? But then that's a different question from, what is the shaman's game plan for the entire game, right? Is it to outcard you? Is it you can kind of think about how they're playing. It's like, okay, how does this shaman plan to win? And you're not going to be correct like 100% of the time, but you know, like later on, you get a sense of that.
Keep in mind, this read at this level, you're talking game plan level. These reads happen way later in the game. You do not make this read on turn 3. You make this read on turn 12. So
right.
Like, what did my opponent do on the early turns is pretty obvious. On the later turns, it's also pretty obvious. What did my opponents not do is more obvious in the later turns. What is my opponent's game plan is not possible to determine until the late game. Like, don't even try for it. That's not part of your checklist until the late game.
But you can sense sort of their quote game plan for this turn. Like, what was their maybe game plan is bad for this turn. What is their intention, right, for this turn? Like more like it, as in setting up an AoE, or their intention is to just make a difficult board for you. So after you ask these 3 questions, what did my opponent do? What did my opponent not do? What is my opponent's game plan? Then I funnel all those into what reads can I make, right? Because you can sort of extract reads from, you know, the second question of what did my opponent not do. You can extract reads from what is my opponent's game plan or something, but your reads are really a combination of these 3 big general questions, and then you keep on answering little by little by little. And this list of what reads you have and all these considerations, it keeps growing from turn to turn. Now, these are things that, as an infinite player, you just sort of passively keep in your head, and they just sort of stick. You have this like whiteboard that you keep on writing it down. You remember it. If you're a new player and if you want this process to stick, you can actually just keep on, you know, writing these down on a pad next to you, or you know, if you have a notepad on your computer, you can keep on typing this stuff. And it does require very careful tracking of cards. Like, you need to make sure that your reads are still up to date, right? It's like Advocate said, you make a read on turn 4, by turn 8, you know, your opponent has drawn a lot more cards. They've gone through other permutations. Your reads have to be kept up to date turn by turn. And also be very careful when establishing reads, because when you are trying to sort of let's say eliminate something, you know, you want to make the read and say my opponent doesn't have AoE. You have to ask, was the move that they ended up making better than what I'm thinking about, better than X, right? So going into turn 7, you're against the mage, you're thinking flame strike, flame strike, flame strike. They didn't flame strike. Well, you know, the question you need to ask is, did they do something that was better or just as good as a flame strike, right? And then you need to weigh these along with, you know, all the information you gather from asking those 3 big questions from turn to turn, and then that's how you make reads. And you'll be surprised if you keep on updating this list, you're going to have a ton of reads by the later turns, right? Like if you watch myself, or if you watch Apta, and a lot of people are just like, wait, how did you get that information? And sometimes it's very hard for us to explain, because it's something like, oh no, we've crossed that off just because based on like this factor in turn 6, this factor in turn 7, this factor in turn 8, now we're very confident that they don't have like a hard removal, right? So I think it all funnels down to that sort of, and that's, it sounds like a lot. So after your opponent makes a move, clicks end turn, you want to think, what did my opponent do? What's my opponent not do? What is my opponent's game plan, or just intention for the previous turn? And then what reads do I have? So that's if we break this down into 2 parts, that would be part 1. do you have anything to add for part one?
It's a really long part, and the point about a checklist is to keep it short, but when it's your opponent's turn, you're not doing anything else. So
Right.
this is the time when you actually want to be doing all the thinking that you can. So this is the part where it's okay to have a longer checklist. And if you ever find yourself not thinking during your opponent's turn, it better be really early on in the game, or you're doing something, or like really late in the game, and he's just top decking, or you're doing something wrong. Because that whole middle section of the game, there's so much to think about, right? Like, if the
Right.
game is contestable at all, this is the time you do your thinking. Because remember, and I keep pounding this in, and people, I think people are starting to come around to this. There is a limited resource. And the limited resource is your ability to think and your time units that you are given to think. And that
Sure.
is something that you really need to take advantage of in your opponent's turn. So this is when you want to be doing this entire checklist as thoroughly as possible, unless you're actually running out of time doing it, which in a normal turn you shouldn't. Like, you're not doing anything else.
Yep. So this is what you want to think. Like, if you do have the time during the turn, like sometimes the opponent just makes a move, like they do nothing. They move really quickly, and then they click end turn. This is still stuff that you should think about. This is stuff that I still think about, except I just do this in a matter of a few seconds. Now, after this, you want to look towards your own hand. The timer has started, right? And the first question you want to ask is just, what options do I have, period? Like, what the cards that you can play are glowing green on your side of the board. So those are your options, right? And then the first thing you want to ask is, what do these, what options do I have? And then what do these options represent, right? As in, when I coach people on stream, I one of the things that seems to hold people back is they look at the cards by the exact definition of the card, right? It's like, okay, what options do we have? They see the Yeti as a Yeti. They see sort of, this minion as that minion. Like, you want to, at this point, translate it and be like, no, the Yeti represents the tempo, right? Like, the Gnomish Inventor represents sort of card draw, more options, a little bit more longevity, in the amount of turns that I expect this game to go. So, once again, the Yeti is not a Yeti. You want to turn the Yeti into a concept, right? That's what I always want to think about. So those are my options. And then the second question I want to ask is, what is my goal for this turn? Like, what do I really want? And this is a question that you are continually asking. So the answer will not be, you're riding on your previous turns as well. But the second question is, what is my goal for this turn? And then another question that you can ask yourself is like, what is my goal for this game, right? This is just something to keep in mind. You should know your goal for this game as soon as you draft. You don't need a lot of extraneous info to know this, but a lot of times it's good to just keep it in your head. It's something I remind myself all the time.
Well, your goals in the game changes.
They
change.
They change.
Like, pretty significantly. Like, especially if you draft a typical mid-range deck, your goals are going to be dependent on what your opponent does. So this is actually going to shift, like, one way or the other, or potentially back again.
Right.
Like, we'll all, when we're streaming, we often say, like, oh, like, you draft a deck and you're like, all right, this is going to be pretty good card advantage, decent tempo. You start playing, you're like, huh, well, it looks like he is so much more card advantage than we are, so let's start pushing.
Yeah. So, like, you're basically, if you want to look at this question, it's like, what are my goals for this game? You can look at it in terms of small pictures, like for this turn. You can look at it, like, your question I see is more of like the medium picture, right? And then like the biggest scale is sort of like, what does this deck do? Like, what does this deck do, really? But I think answering.
So, but what is that? What does that have to do with looking at your hand?
No, it's not after you look towards your hand, right? I'm saying you weigh your options, and before you so the first thing you do is see what options do I have, and then you sort of just do a mental check and just make sure it's like, okay, these are my goals for a turn, and this is how my deck plays out, right? And this is like the stuff that's in my deck. This is how it typically plays out. Like, I think these are things to keep in mind before you go down to sort of the next question.
So what's the actual thing on the checklist? I am a player. I'm trying to take your advice. What do I do?
Right. So Number one, you ask yourself, what options do I have, right? You look at all the glowing
Right.
things, and then you say, all right, I have 5 things I can play. And then afterwards, you want to ask, what is my goal for this turn, right?
Okay.
So, like,
right.
what do I
right. The
want to
small
do?
picture goal. Uh huh.
Right. And then you can ask, your question, what I would call it, the medium question is like, how do I want this game to go? Or what is my goal for this game, right? That's your question? Yes?
Okay, but like, what is my goal for the game? How do I know that?
I mean, that's based on what your opponent has done, right? It's like you said, it changes during the game. Like, if they are, I don't know, playing a little bit faster, then maybe you're like, okay, I need to play a little bit more defensively, right? So
Okay, so that's the medium question, because I thought the step
that's
before that was the medium question.
No, that's the small. It's like just what you want to do for the turn. Like, after your opponent has done something, what am I prioritizing for this turn?
Right. But the one after that, did you only do 2 things?
Yeah, I only did 2
Oh,
things.
okay. Sorry. I thought you did 3 things.
No. I'm saying you're introducing a third thing. Like, my thing is going from the smallest to the very biggest, and I just assumed that I'm like, yeah, you can figure out this stuff in the middle. And you introduce sort of the middle question, right? It's like, given the circumstances, how do we set our goal? Which I think is fine, But I would consider
so
that
what's the big question?
What is in our deck, and how does this deck usually play?
But that's not a question in your checklist. That's something you should know before you start the game.
No. I think it should be a question in the checklist, because I think it's something that people forget about a lot, because they think
so
about.
You write down the answer before the game starts, and you just keep looking at it again every turn.
Yep.
And the answer never changes, because it's about what your deck does.
But it's one of those things that I think people. It's like when people tunnel vision a lot, right? And then they just sort of think about the turn, and then suddenly it's like they don't see the forest, right? They just see trees, like singular trees everywhere, and they forget about the forest.
Okay, but what you're saying, analogy aside, is we have a deck, it wins generally on value because we have a lot of like big cards and card draws and all that. I write this statement down, and then every turn I look at it again.
Yeah. That's absolutely fine.
Okay.
I would just
I just want to make sure, because I think you need to be clear because the checklist is supposed to be operational, right? If you create a checklist of theory, it doesn't really help anyone. It's just like us talking about the game. So if I'm a person trying to follow this checklist, I get very confused now when I'm looking at big picture, because I think, I don't know, it's part of the checklist. I should maybe adjust it or like do something, but we're not doing that for this part, where obviously each turn has to adjust. You're saying this middle picture that I'm talking about, whether we're actually going for card advantage or for tempo or for reach, is something to adjust. But the big picture of what our deck typically does, right, what we're likely to draw into, how our deck generally functions, is just a statement. And you just want to review it.
Well, no, a checklist is just something for you to check off, right? So,
but what are you checking off there? What's the to-do?
The to-do is to just remind yourself.
Okay, so the to-do is not about what your next move is. It's not about any of that. It's literally just about make sure you didn't forget this thing that you knew in the beginning of the game.
Sure, you can qualify as that. I mean, a checklist is a checklist as long as you do it, right?
Right. I don't think of something that's a constant quality of the deck as something that I'm doing every turn.
That's fair. I mean, it's however you want to categorize it. In the end, it is something to like. What is a checklist if not things for you to do right during the turn?
See, I'm reading the chat right now. Like, Seal Von Thurman brings up a good point, which is kind of my point as well. And he says, show me a checklist. Like, what's the actual checklist? I am in a game. I am trying to play this game. You're saying that after I make the moves, I should go down a list of things to consider. Like,
right.
I would categorize the overall game plan things as so off of the checklist that it's like, knowing what a board clear is. It's like that. It's like what your deck is. It's a pre-game evaluation that you do.
But, sure. I mean, you could say it's a pre-game evaluation. So what? Do you not think of it? Like, I think this is a very good time to remind yourself of it. And, from like, basically it is your argument that like, I don't agree with this being here. Like, I don't understand, or like it should be somewhere else, or it just shouldn't be in here.
I'm questioning what a checklist is. I think the question is, what is a checklist? What is this supposed to do? What do you want the checklist to do?
Right. A checklist is something to make sure that you are doing the important things that you need to do during the turn in order to maximize the output of your turn. That's it. And I think, so you want to make sure that each one of your steps, each one of your considerations is in there. And I think this is a very important consideration. So if you think that this is not as important
No,
or
okay,
that
so
it shouldn't be in there, I mean, that's fine. Like everyone has their own checklist, right? I am going through what I think is a good checklist for beginning players and for whoever needs a checklist.
all right, so for this turn, I'm going to just go over this again because I'm still confused. And if I'm confused, I feel like the listeners will be even more confused.
I don't think people are confused as you. But
okay, well, just in case people are as confused as me. So the small step when it's on your turn and you're thinking about it is what you're actually doing on this turn. And like what your goals are for this turn.
What is my goal for this turn? Yes.
Okay. So your goal would be, for example, like remove his, threatening minion or push some face damage or something like that. Like, what are some examples? What does that mean?
Sure. So, goal for this turn, let's say. They put down a vicious fledgling, right? My goal is to kill off the vicious fledgling. Like, that's a very specific goal, right? That would be an example.
Okay.
It could be a little bit more general, like a hunter is, has quite a lot of tempo on the board, right? So your goal can be, let's stop his aggression. That could be a goal, right? Mm-hmm. So it could be something very specific from I need to remove this very specific card to I just need to stop his aggression, whether it's through an AoE or through a taunt, right? Like, let's say you have both or something, and then you can decide. That is what I would consider, the first step, right?
Okay. And then the middle step is based on how the tempo, card advantage, face, or whatever is going, how am I going to adjust my strategy to win the game in the big picture?
Yes.
And then the third step is to then remind yourself of what cards are left in your deck and what you're likely to draw into.
Right. Just sort of how does this deck usually operate?
Okay. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's very different from my checklist. My checklist doesn't have the third part because I think the third part is completely unimportant. Because the second part covers how you're going to win the game. Like, it's kind of built into the second part, but because in order to figure out whether you are winning the game through card advantage or like through tempo or what you're doing on the board, you have to evaluate all the factors, and what is left in your deck is one of the factors.
No, I mean, I definitely agree that it is one of the factors, but I think having that even bigger sort of reminder is very important, just because a lot of people sort of don't think about the foundational level of their deck. And I found that through coaching quite a lot as well, that like this reminder sort of helps them, I guess, get out of the tunnel vision. Like I said, if you don't think it's like people's checklists are going to be different, right? And we can't just sit here saying like, it's like, I don't think that's like, and you guys can decide on your own, the listeners. If you want to knock off one of these steps, that's absolutely fine. So I feel as if we even need to.
Okay. I mean, let's go back to the next part of the checklist. So it's your turn. You look at your options. You look at your goals.
Mm-hmm. Next, basically, the important thing about asking for your goals, micro and macro, if that's how we want to describe it, is to lead to the next question: what can be easily eliminated, right? Because now that you've identified your choices, and then I think the second part is sort of identifying the goals, whether you want, however you want to magnify them. The next step is getting rid of the easy sort of eliminated options, right? There are, and it's hard to give an example, but there are a lot of turns where you look at your 5 options and you can just see 1 or 2 of them are just completely terrible, right? Like just absolutely terrible, because let's say, you don't have a board, you're being aggressed as well, and you have a lot of better options. And one of them is like a Cult Master, right? It's like no tempo, doesn't get you cards as well. So you're just like that is just something that you easily eliminate.
Technically you could do that, but you're not getting value out of the card and you're not getting tempo out of the card.
Right. So after you get rid of the easily eliminated choices, now you want to whittle down the quote hard choices, right? The stuff that's left. Now you want to ask sort of these questions, and you don't have to ask them in the exact order. But the questions that you want to think about to whittle down your hard choices are remembering your reads. What is number one is sort of what is most annoying for your opponent, right? You should sort of know by a certain point in the game, sort of what they can handle or what they were able to handle and what they weren't able to handle, and sort of what they've already done, right? Like maybe the fact that they've already played quite a few big removals, you're just like, well, I've tested big removals, I haven't tested AoE. You sort of make those considerations. Also, remembering your reads, what do you need to play around, right? What do you need to play around? Like, let's say you have not tested a big removal yet, and they are holding, like a priest is holding onto 4 cards and has not played them at all, right? Then if you have an option to not play like a giant mastodon, you're probably thinking, maybe I don't play the giant mastodon. Next, you want to think, what am I doing for the next turn? Mana wise, sort of what creature am I sort of forced to play, right? And that can help you decide what you're doing for this turn as well. If you know you're playing like a Volcanosaur, if you know you're doing this or that, it can help whittle down your choices as well. And finally, sort of you want to ask, what can I expect from my opponent next turn? And the subsets to this question would be sort of how much tempo do you expect to see? Now, there's going to be expectation busters, right? Maybe they have a 0 mana Nerubian Prophet in hand. Stuff like, what was it? What's the 2/6 healer that heals up to full?
Hosen.
What?
Hosen.
Yeah, Hosen healer. You can't really expect a Hosen healer on something big, right? That's a lot of tempo. Are there any special cards I need to play around, right? Final Lines Portal, Dragonfire Potion, all that stuff. But so these are the questions you want to ask in no specific order.
In no specific order or priority. These are like general things to think about when you're playing the game.
Yeah. So this is these are the questions, and this is the hard part, right? Like this is what you're going to spend most of the time on your turn on, is whittling down the hard choices. And this is what's hard about it, because the other stuff I can say just go step by step. For this one, I cannot tell you is like, okay, here's the question you want to ask first, here's the question you want to ask second. I think these 4 things that I listed, what's annoying for your opponent, what do you need to play around, what am I doing the next turn, and what should I expect from my opponent? I think those will lead you to the correct answer, but you have to like combine all these in a certain way.
Well, that's why it's a checklist. You just check it after you think about it. Like, you don't need to do it in a specific order.
No, you don't. And you will find sort of the best way to ask these, because it's almost like a puzzle. By asking one of these questions and answering it, it'll illuminate another question, right? Like it'll illuminate the answer to another question, but sometimes you have to like ask it in the right order. So, and this is just one of those soft factors that you will get much better at the more you play. But, if you write this stuff down and sort of think about it, it will help you out. So that is what you should be doing during your turn. Adukta, do you have any thoughts before I go to the very short final segment?
Nope, go for it.
All right, so after you click end turn, after you've done this, after you made the best move in Hearthstone's existence, all right?
Which is not very hard, by the way. Like, you'll make the best move out of any turn, like, I don't know, like 80% of the time, even if you're not very good at this game. Because the game doesn't give you that many options for the most part.
So, after you click end turn, this is important. When your opponent is just doing stuff, basically when you want to alt-tab into Netflix, please don't do that. You want to observe your opponent even when they're doing things. And this helps so much with you getting into your opponent's head, making reads. You want to look at the speed at which they play, the speed at which they do things. And it will reveal, I'm trying to find another word for it, but I can't. And you know what I'm talking about. Their happiness level.
You mean eagerness.
Yeah, eagerness or happiness. Yeah, eagerness sounds a lot better than happiness.
Yes.
No, but their eagerness in playing something, right? And sometimes I know I have a good read of sort of not only specific cards, but their game plan as well, by how eager they are to do something. Also, a lot of times, like you put down something, like I put down a corrupted heal bot on turn 5. It goes to the rogue's turn 5. The rogue immediately targets my corrupted healbot with a card and then backs away, right? It's like, oh, no. And then plays something else. I'm like, okay, well, they didn't target it before. I'm like, there's a good chance the rogue has like, an assassinate, right? But then it was just like, no, I don't want to just stay even. I want to like get ahead. So I'm going to play this like Silverhand Knight and try to do stuff. But then that's one of those things, you want to look for the targeting, you want to look for their eagerness, all of these things as well. So that's what you want to look for. And then they click end turn, and then it starts to process all over again. That's basically it. Easy peasy. It only took like 30 minutes to explain.
I know. You like wrote this. You sent me the outline, and you're like 15 minutes is all I need. I'm like, no way. Well, like I see all this stuff.
To be fair, you did take away 10 minutes.
I did take away 10 minutes, but it's been 40.
No, it's been 30. It's been 35, and we spent 5 at the very beginning. So I have taken 20.
Okay.
And I would say you tripped me up quite a bit.
Okay, because I didn't understand that part of the checklist. I thought that's like something that that's my definition of something you should not be wasting your time thinking about, because you should already just know it. And to put it on a checklist just takes your mental energy and your rope time to be.
I do agree that this is something that you should just know, but a lot of people like saying, "Oh, you should just know this and remember." Like this checklist is for people who like are having trouble, quote, knowing the stuff, right? So I think
but the stuff is what your deck is supposed to do. Why are you doing a run evaluation of what your deck is supposed to do? What are you doing when you're drafting if you don't have an idea of what your deck can do?
You should be doing it then as well. But I think if you don't remind yourself, the fact that you are reminding yourself of this helps you with your decision making during your turn. So. Very quickly.
Yeah, redo the checklist. Like not redo, but like go over the checklist and what it's supposed to be doing, because you kind of like went by a point and then you explained it and then another point. If I ask any of the listeners right now to recreate your checklist, no one will be able to right now. So we can recreate the checklist.
As soon as your opponent does stuff, you want to ask, what did my opponent do? You want to translate specific cards to ideas like tempo and card advantage. So question 1 is, what did my opponent do? Question 2 is, what did my opponent not do? They didn't play AoE. They didn't play, a certain minion. So that's question 2. Question 3 is, what is my opponent's game plan, right? For this turn or for the entire game. And as our advocate says, this is something you're going to keep on building upon. And then question 4, using the answer to the first 3 questions, you want to ask, what reads do I have? And this requires a very careful tracking of cards. And you want to be very careful when establishing reads, right? You want to be careful that you don't make an incorrect read. You're not too eager to make a read. So
that's their turn. Now it's your turn.
Well, I mean, this could be your turn as well, assuming that they play really quickly and just click end turn, right?
Right.
It could be. But yes, if they give you the time, you want to do this during their turn. Now, you want to look towards your own hand, and the first question you want to ask is, what options do I have, right? And once again, you want to turn cards into concepts. It's not just the Yeti, it's tempo, right? It's not just Gnomish Inventor, it's card draw. And then after that, you want to ask, what is my goal, right? And this is where Adwix and I got into a very lengthy discussion. But, what is my goal? And I guess we can categorize it for the sort of immediate turn, for, the long term as well, right? And then the next question after that is, what can be easily eliminated out of the options that I have? I think this doesn't require too much more explanation. Now, this is, and then after that, the question is sort of, what is my best choice, right? And then in order to answer that, you want to ask these 4 questions. Remembering your reads, what is the most annoying thing for your opponent? Number 2, remembering your reads, what do you need to play around? Number 3, what am I doing the next turn? And number 4, what should I expect from my opponent next turn? How much tempo? Should I be fearing any special cards? Spike Ridge Steed, Firelands Portal, the stuff that really ruins your day. And then make your best choice, click end turn. And during your opponent's turn, these are no longer questions, but you want to look out for stuff like, their eagerness to play a card, them targeting with cards that they ultimately don't play, but give you a hint about those cards, and it starts all over again. That is the process, guys. The process. Trust the process.
All right. So that's the really complicated process. Now I'll give you guys my process. It's a lot simpler because I don't have the bandwidth to think about all these things in a turn, and I get similar results to Merps in the win rates. So I feel like this is a nice and condensed process, and it starts with the hard part, which is the same part Merps is talking about that you really just can't skip, which is evaluating your options, right? Like, what can I actually do on your turn? Like, you just can't skip that. That's most of the game. But it doesn't really take a process for it. It's just a checklist of things you think about, right? So figure out what your options are in the beginning and is what your actual viable options are. And then pick the one that is the best. The best being the one that is the most tempo or the most card advantage depending on what you want out of the turn. And then your next step, so that's step 1, picking the best move, right? Simple. So once you pick the best move, you ask, does my opponent want me to do this move? Does my opponent not want me to do this move? Or does my opponent not care, or I have no reads on my opponent? So if my opponent wants me to do this move, never do that move unless you have no other moves. If my opponent does not want me to do that move, you have your move. You're done. And if you don't know, then you're also done. You're just doing your best move. So if you're just always do your best move, you're probably going to stand a pretty good chance of winning. Except sometimes you don't want to do your best move because your opponent wants you to do your best move. In those cases, do your second best move. Done. That's my entire process when it comes to what I'm doing on my turn. And on the opponent's turn, you just get reads, right? The same way Merps is talking about. Just think about stuff.
Right. So, I mean, this is something which, if you actually ask me or Outlook, how do you think about a turn? I can't really describe it anymore. It's become so weird and amorphous. It's really hard to
no, it's just very easy. Like you have something on here that I really resonated with on your list, which is just make your opponent uncomfortable. Like, what does your opponent not want you to do? Like, if you keep making your opponent uncomfortable with your plays, they're gonna lose.
Right. No. But you see the problem with that. You're saying, oh, just make them uncomfortable. Then that begs the question, what makes them uncomfortable?
Right. What makes them uncomfortable is your best move minus the moves that would, that they actually want you to make.
Right. But how do you get to what is my best move?
How do you get to that entire list that you were talking about with whittling down your choices? That's how you get to your best move. And what your opponents are uncomfortable with are your reads on your opponent.
Yeah. No, and I totally agree. But for each one of those, I feel like you have to sort of do a little bit more hand-holding. You have to do a little bit more in depth, right?
Okay.
With even those, and that's why I think this is not my personal checklist. I do not, but I think that this is a good checklist for people. This is a good way to think about it in terms of, if you do need to, just really hash it out step by step, I think this can be a helpful checklist for people. So.
Yeah. All right. So that's a question from the GOAT. Brought to you by Patreon. Patreon.com/grinninggoat. It's the way to support the podcast. And thank you guys so much to our patrons who do so. All right. Next, we're going to move on to a totally different topic rather than how to think about the game in this general process-oriented way. We're going to talk about what the game actually does with its cards and stuff. Deep fried meta, where we deep fry the meta. And right now in the Unworld meta, one of the most dominant things in the meta is taunts. You have taunts, your opponent has taunts, everybody has taunts, taunt. That's what's happening right now. So I want to first outline kind of what the effect of a taunt is beyond the basics. It makes you have to hit it first, and you can't hit other stuff until you hit it. And then I want to move into how to play cards with expectations of taunts and all that. Okay, so this is so important because if you ever find yourself losing the board for no good reason and your opponent winning the board for no good reason, it could be because your cards are bad, but more likely than not, you're doing weird stuff about taunts. And the way to play around a taunt is not the taunt happens and then you play around it. Or your opponent does something and then you use a taunt reactively. That's maybe 25% of the way to play taunts. But the other 75% of the way to play taunts and to play against taunts is to preempt the taunt. In order to be good in the Unworld meta, you have to play as if assuming you have a taunt in your hand, you have to play each turn thinking that you're going to taunt the next turn and what would make the best board. If you're facing an opponent, you have to always prepare a board with the question of, what if my opponent taunts? In your mind. Because this is also why we keep saying this, right? Minions take more skill than spells. Because with a spell, you just react immediately and you're done, right? They play a taunt, you get rid of it, boom, done. With a minion, you have to prepare. And even though we are in a more spell-based meta, there are still way more minions than spells. You're still playing more of a minion-based game than a spell-based game. So if you can get that advantage by preparing for it, it makes a huge difference. Okay, so back to what taunts do. Your opponent plays a taunt for one of two reasons. One, he's protecting one of his minions that he doesn't want you to kill directly. Two, he's protecting his face. Or three, it just happens to be his best minion, in which case no one cares if it has taunt or not, right? So you have to first identify what you're weak against. So your strategy currently could be weak against taunts because you need to hit your opponent's face, or they could be weak against taunts because you need to use your minions as removals because you don't have removals in your hand. So whenever you're putting minions on the board, you always have to think, what am I weak to? Like, based on what I want to do and based on what my hand has, what am I weak to? So again, going back to what we were doing last week, if we have a hard removal in our hand, we don't really need our minions to hit a big giant thing. So we're okay if they taunt, right? If it's a small taunt, we can eat it or do one trade. If it's like a large taunt, we just remove it. Like, it's all good. If you have a small removal, then you don't care if he plays something and then hides something behind the taunt, because you can remove that, right? It takes him, he has to play two things on that turn. He can't play a big thing and a taunt. He's going to play a medium thing and a medium taunt probably, or like small things. So your removal can remove it. So again, you're not vulnerable. You don't have to use the minions on the board as you don't have to use your own minions on the board as removal. You're safe. And so in the situations in which you have pretty much any removal in your hand, you don't have to worry about the taunt on the board effect, and you just have to worry about how much do I really need to hit his face. On the other hand, if you don't have removals in your hand, you need to always prepare your board for the inevitable taunt. And the taunts are going to be big and they're going to be diverse. So you're going to have big taunts, you're going to have small taunts like Gastropod that act big, and in order to deal with that efficiently without removals, what you need to do is set up a board that's very high on attack and has a diverse amount of attack. So you have your 5/4s, you have your 4/3s, you have your 2/2s, 1/1s, whatever that you could just throw into things. If you have no removals in your hand, you need to set up a board like that. Now you may be thinking, well, a board like that seems really weak to Flame Strike or Consecration or whatever. So that's where your reads have to come in. You have to like try to bait out one of them or try to get a read on that. Because in this meta, large taunts are more frequently seen than board clears. So if you have no reads, you're going to play into the board clear away from the large taunt. Like, so that you can take care of a large taunt. That's just how you're going to have to play. It's not desirable because you're basically saying, well, a third of the time I lose because he's going to board clear me. So you want that kind of read. Now, it's hard to get a read that your opponent doesn't have a large taunt unless you've been hitting his face and he has played a turn that is already not a taunt. Then you know he doesn't have a taunt. But once you get one of the two reads, you can play based off of that. So in this meta, that's the most important read that you can make, is whether your opponent has a large taunt or a board clear, or possibly both or possibly neither. Like, and you only make the read when you present your opponent with a situation in which they would use that card if that were their best card, and then they don't. I mean, and then they don't, right? So yeah, they could be baiting you, but probably not. They probably, like 95% of the time, they actually just don't have that card. And so that's how you deal with the taunt when you don't have removals. When you have removals, obviously much easier to deal with the taunt. And in that case, you could like play a bit more safer. You can get your high health minions. You could play what I call normal, but you don't always have a removal in your hand. And it may also be worth it because of this. This is like literally what defines how you win and lose games outside of like card value in this meta. It is like the most important thing. So if you have a removal and you want to remove something, but you don't really have to use the removal to remove the thing, don't do it. Because once you have no removals, you're in this weird game in which you have to keep preparing for a taunt and then you lose. So if you have no reads on your opponent, and you have only one removal in your hand, and you could use that removal for a little bit of extra tempo or card advantage or something, or you can trade some minions on the board, or you can just like go face or whatever, don't use up that removal. That removal is highly, highly valuable because it is allowing you to put the optimal board on so that your opponent doesn't screw you over with the taunt. Like, it's like thinking like 2 or 3 steps ahead, right? Like, you're using it in a protective manner. The way I can think about it is, like, if you play Overwatch and you have a Roadhog on your team, once he uses the hook, it's on cooldown. Your opponent will be able to go into all these areas. On the other hand, if you just hold the hook and do nothing with it, yeah, it's not getting any value. You may not even get great value out of it later, but you have zoned your opponent out. Now, in the case of Overwatch, everyone knows Roadhog has a hook. Here, no one knows what like spells you have, so they'll actually like play into it. But so that, what I mean is they'll actually play into it, and then you can actually get good value. And if they don't play into it, now you can make sure that they don't screw you because you also don't know what they have, right? Like if I'm Roadhog and I'm hooking like a target, I know I have hooked a target. Targets are generally similar, right? But in Hearthstone, who knows? If they taunt something and they may be hiding something very valuable that you need to remove. It may be costing you lethal to not be able to remove something on the board. The lack of information on both sides makes it so that both your removal having more value in your hand because you can bait because they will play into it, and their taunts in their hand having more value because you can't play around them because you kind of have to play around them necessarily, whether they have it or not. So that's how the mind games of the taunt meta works. And on the bright side, there is like literally a very clear-cut way to play around it, to the optimal way. And we've just outlined that for you. So that's how you play around your opponent having taunts. And there's nothing more, or you know, when I say removal, like silence also works. So silence is kind of a removal when it comes to taunts. So that's it. If you consistently do that whole process that is, you know, kind of convoluted and really involves looking 3 turns ahead and involves trying to find reads, if you do that consistently, you'll have a very high win rate in this meta because that is what this meta is. Now, you know, the impact of this is going to probably be smaller in the next meta, but for Ungoro, this is kind of key right now.
Play around the hook, man.
Play around the hook.
Okay. Call when the hook is on cooldown.
Yeah. All right, so building on that, card good bad, where we tell you whether a card is good or bad, is a taunt. It's your basic taunt in this meta. It's Tar Creeper, Tar Lurker, and Tar Lord. We're actually raising Tar Lord by a couple points, but right now, Tar Creeper is a 128. It's a 136 for Warlock, and I only put that there because Tar Lurker is a 127, and I want to show that Tar Lurker is actually much worse than Tar Creeper. It's just Warlocks have a lot of uses for taunts. So Tar Creeper, if you have been not playing the arena, is a 1/5 taunt for 3 mana that gets 2 extra attack to make it a 3/5 taunt whenever it's the opponent's turn. Tar Lurker, which you actually may not know because no one plays Warlock these days, is a 5 mana 1/7 that gets +3 to attack on your opponent's turn. So it's a 1/7 on your turn taunt, which is crap, and then it's a 4/7 taunt on your opponent's turn, which is not even that great. It's only like 1 defense more than your Druid of the Claw here. Yeah. And is basically the same as a Nesting Rock, right? Like if you can trigger it. Right. So it's not really that great of a card. So 127 is pretty high score for not that great of a card, and it's a pretty high score for that because Warlocks really care about that taunt. That those high health taunts really do matter for Warlock. So these cards are obvious. Tar Lord is the warrior card. That's a 5/11 taunt for 7 mana on your opponent's turn, and then 1/11 on your turn. So these cards are all really good because they have a lot of stats. They're taunts, so their stats are actually effective. Like when your opponent is playing, they can't just like ignore this thing. But they do like. I kind of don't really want to talk about how good or bad they are. Everyone knows they're good. I remember when we first rated Tar Creeper. Like, so many people were like, no, it's not that good. You're going to regret rating it that high. And no, it's really just that good. And it is that good, and it was pretty easily predictable because you can just map out the turns in which it would be that good, in which it does stop your opponents, and then map out the turns in which it's less good because it's a 1/5. The main takeaway from these cards that I want to talk about is how you play them and how you play around them. Right, going back to the deep fried meta. So playing around them is the same when it comes to not expecting them to put it down and then they put it down. But once these cards come onto the board, you are left with 2 choices. You can stall and just build up a bigger board until you have a big minion that can actually kill them off in 1 hit and get a free kill, basically. Or you can immediately throw your mismatched minions into them, let them have a 2-for-1, and then keep going. So the way to face these guys, and I see people make this mistake all the time, is unless you have a read that your opponent has a board clear that'll really be punishing, And unless if you can get through this taunt, you can do something else on this turn. Like if you have a charge minion, or if you just have so much tempo on the board already that you can then remove another minion, all you do is you stall out. Like, just stall out. Stalling out is almost always the correct choice. Because, assuming that you can stall out with a minion that can eat this minion. So if you're facing a Tar Creeper especially, like anything like a 5/5 will do, or just anything, right? Force him, because now every time you play a 5/5, what you've done is you've created a threat onto the board. The threat will remove their very high value Tar Creeper. So then they have to burn a removal to remove your 5/5. And so in a threat and response meta, which this is still a threat and response meta, every time you turn a regular 5/5 into a threat, that's insane value. Right? So that's the basics of it. Now, for something like Tar Lurker with 7 health, it's a little more difficult to get, like, you know, a really big minion that can, like, hit it and survive and get some value out of it. And you may have to sacrifice 1 minion anyway, so you may think about just trading 2 minions if that's all it takes. But you can still stall out if you do have those big minions. And for a Tar Lord, which is 11 health, fine. You know, throw a couple minions in preemptively because you're not going to have anything that has 11 attack. But definitely for Tar Creeper, you want to stall.
And it's part of the value of these cards, right? Like the ability to have you stall, there is a lot of value in that on the side that is playing the taunt. But at the same time, it's like Adulta says, if you are just straight up every time giving value to these minions and just saying, I am going to straight up give you value for a 7 mana 5/11 taunt, or straight up giving you value for a 3 mana 3/5 taunt, you are not trying to capitalize on any sort of downside of the card, right? And you should consider that. It is hard, though, just because it requires an additional layer of thinking, right? Additional layer of risk analysis, which is part of the power of these cards as well. It can cause you to misplay. But these are things that you have to be able to exploit. Like, you have to get used to trying to exploit the weaknesses of these cards if you are... if you're trying to maximize your wins, because otherwise they are going to farm you for value.
It's the same concept to a less big extent that, like, say, like Venture Co. You know how we always recommend, like, try to keep it alive for a turn. Don't put out things with 6 attack or more. Don't remove it unless you, like, are going to, like, you know, lose 7 health and then, like, die, right? Like, try to keep it around. Try to force your opponent to actually use the downside. And these guys have pretty big downsides. It has 1 attack. Like, you know, when you've had a Tar Creeper on your side, that 1 attack does not do as much as you want it to do. Like, it's pretty weak when your 3-drop can only deal 1 attack. So, when they put the Tar Creeper out, you may think of it as they just want to stall the board. They're not actually taking the initiative back, because their Tar Creeper itself has so little initiative on the next turn that the Tar Creeper has to stall for more than 1 turn in order for this whole net initiative equation to favor your opponent. So in that 1 turn, you can create whatever threats you want if you don't remove the Tar Creeper, just by playing like a medium-sized minion. Now, on the flip side, if you're using your taunts, you want your taunts to... And I'm going to go back to the deep fried meta on this, because it affects that as well. If you are, like, trying to play your taunts, right? What you don't want to do is play a taunt on an empty board, unless you have to. What you want to do, and what you also don't want to do, is on an empty or near empty board, play a taunt with another minion, and you're like, oh, I'm going to protect that minion. Do that only if you have to. What you want to do is put out a bunch of stuff and be like, hey, look, you should put minions down to try to match up really, really well against my minions. And then the next turn, drop a giant taunt and say, ha, I actually have a 5/11 taunt, and you have a bunch of 4/5s because you thought your 4/5s are going to match up really, really well against my 3/3s, but now they match up really, really crappy against my 7/11 or 5/11 or whatever taunt my Tar Lord is. So, ha, if you don't have a hard removal, you're going to be in for a bad time. And try to make the read that they don't have a hard removal before you do that, because if they do, that's like a really large commitment. But Tar Creepers are really good for that, right? Like, you do some trades on the board, or what? Like, you put out some minions, you do some trades on the board, you have like 1 or 2 health, and you put out a Tar Lord, a Tar Creeper to protect it, right? Or they do a move, and they have the expectation that you will not taunt, you taunt. Like, taunt has initiative. Always try to play it in a way where you're actually using that initiative, because that's a big part of its value. And the way most taunts work is you can set up your board with minions beforehand to trick your opponent into playing a certain way. So a good use of Tar Creeper, for example, is the turn before that to play 1 really, really, really huge minion that doesn't have taunt. So what does your opponent do? They play a bunch of small minions because that's how you counter a really, really big minion, unless they have a hard removal. And so they do that, and what do? You play a Tar Creeper, and it gets an insane amount of value unless your opponent removes it, right? You do stuff like that, and you just edge out a lot of like tempo, a lot of card advantage, and you end up winning. And Taunts is such a big part of the meta that if you learn how to do it with Taunts, you just get a good amount of like benefit right off the bat. It's not the whole game, but it's a large part of the game right now. Okay,
good stuff.
So, yeah, that's it for Card Good Bad. Tar Creeper, Tar Lurker, Tar Lord, all good cards, all great cards. Either premium or very near premium. Which brings us to the class with Tar Lurker and the class in which taunts are worth even extra value, the Warlock.
Warlocks, man, they are not in a great spot right now. So many tools were taken away from them in terms of Imp Gang Boss, Power Overwhelming, and the taunt meta definitely helps them out, right? Having access to Tar Creeper and Tar Lurker helps them out a lot. Having stuff like a Primordial Drake is really good. The only problem with the Warlock is so much of their early game and tempo plays were taken away. And what do they have left? They have a good hero power, but they have significantly less proactive options to sort of establish an early board and protect themselves and really extract value out of their hero power. Because they really do not have any power plays on the early turns anymore, right? Like, there's no real Warlock card that gives them the advantage in the early turns. They could have really used something like Alley Cat or Lost in the Jungle, right? A card that immediately...
They didn't get it.
They didn't get it for this expansion. They got, like, they got some good cards. Like, Feeding Time is not a bad card, right? 5 minutes, deal 3 damage, gain 3 1/1s. It's a perfectly fine card, but it's not what the Warlock needed. They needed sort of like the Alley Cat or Lost in the Jungle to help them
small cards.
Get them. Yeah, they needed small cards to get on the board, and then they needed to keep Power Overwhelming to really just explode on tempo, right? I know you were never a fan of the card, and you're happy they got rid of it, but losing all of these tools certainly hurt the Warlock a lot, and they're a class that is very, right now, very susceptible to having an awkward hand and just like not able to use their hero power. And then even when you get to their power turns, like Fellfire Potion, right? Or Siphon Soul, it could just be too damaging or too slow.
Yep.
So they are in this spot where like they can have some pretty powerful stuff, but because of their lack of early game and because of their lack of like proactive options in the early to mid game, they are very weak right now.
Yeah, so like Merps highlighted, the main problem with Warlock is that they still have a bunch of 1-drops, but they don't have like an overpowering number of 1-drops, and they have no 2-drops, right? Without 2-drops, how are you going to make a curve? Without a curve, how are you going to do anything Warlocky? You're going to have to play that weird control style that kind of came into play in MSG, and you can't do that. Why? Because there's no Abyssal Enforcers anymore. Oh my god, Blizzard, what are you doing to this class? You're like actually taking a hammer to it, and not just because of the new cards you're making, but you've actually restructured the entire game to make this a bad class. Like, almost singling it out, right? It's like very discriminatory. I don't like it. It kind of fits in what Blizzard does. They really don't care about the classes that are represented by quote-unquote evil heroes, right? Like, Warriors get the shaft, Warlock gets the shaft. They're just very much... Look, this is why Paladins are never going to be bad. This is just why. They are a good class, so they will never be bad. Okay, now what is the Warlock, though? Let's say you're going to have to play the Warlock. Let's say you're in our position or you just love the Warlock. You just need to play the Warlock. How are you going to get the Warlock to win? Well, first, you need to identify the best card of this expansion for the Warlock, which is the Tar Lurker, which is what we talked about. So the way to win as the Warlock is you need to micro out these little card advantage and these tempo gains with your board. How do you get a board? You need to draft really, 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 really low. You need to draft lower than you used to want to draft low because the control option is not as great anymore as it used to be. And you have less ability to draft even lower, which means anytime you like even see a 2, you're taking it. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, if the difference is between like a Shadow Flame and a Raptor, I don't know. I would not like think you're crazy to take the Raptor like on the first pick. We rate Shadowflame like 50 points higher than a Raptor. But this is where the meta is right now, where yes, Shadowflame is the value and it does help.
And
you get back
identifying
onto the
that you
board.
will never actually be approached with this choice. However,
Right.
like, theoretically, yes.
Okay, but like, you know, another theoretical choice, for example, that may like make more sense, like a Galaka Crawler versus a Shadowflame, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Like a Darkshire Librarian, which is only at 88 versus a Shadowflame. Depending on what you're trying to do, like even if you're so much as like 10 cards in, the 2-drops may be just that valuable over the Shadowflame. Anyway, so your win card is Tar Lurker, which is not a great win card. It's a very high value card for Warlock, but it's not a win card. It's just like a thing. It's like when the Druid's win card was like Ironbark, was Ironbark. It was not a very good win card. Yeah, Ironbark Protector. There we go. It was just not a very good win card. You still rely on your swipes and your Druid of the Claws much more. It's the same thing here. Now, another card that is good that you'll see a lot, like Feeding Time's okay. It's not really that good. It's like 6 tempo if you use it perfectly for 5 mana. Like it's okay. It's more important that it is a removal, and the Warlocks desperately need removal. But the other card, and you have like Chidling Tunneler, which is like 3/3. It's a really good card because you get a free card out of it at the cost of health, but that actually helps your tempo, right? So that's like a very key card for the tempo thing. And we keep coming back to this. The Warlock's problem is tempo. It needs tempo early in order to hero power, so you need to find ways to get tempo without costing you too much health. This is very hard to do, so any cards that do that just have extra premium value. And if you are able to set up a deck like that, it also plays right into your other really good card, which is Corrupting Mist. It's 2 mana, kill everything. That's pretty good. Especially if what you have on the board right now is a taunt. Because you know what the taunt does? It taunts. So you don't care if it dies the next turn if all your opponent's stuff also dies the next turn. You play this, and then you play your other set of minions, your taunt is going to die in the beginning of the next turn, but it doesn't matter. If your opponent wants to do anything, they have to get through your taunt anyway. And then you play a bunch of small stuff, because you need to have small stuff. And then if they have a big stuff, their big stuff is either going to remove one of your small stuff and die, or hit face and then die. Either way, it all comes back to the same exact playstyle that is very difficult to draft because of the offering odds, but it's what you absolutely need to do because the other ways of playing Warlock just don't work. Like, you need to have your small stuff. Lots and lots of small stuff. You need to have your taunts. And then it'll open up the gates for other things, like Corrupting Mist, like your Corruption, like your, Feeding Time, which puts down 3/1/1s, which are small things, and we need small things, right? Even in the late game. And it allows you to use things like Chilling Tunneler without taking too much face damage so that, you don't get the value out of it. So, once again, the hero power gives you infinite card advantage if you can protect yourself. So, lots of taunts. Anything that can cheat tempo at all is good. And I want to give another one shout out to the Ravenous Pterodax. A lot of people think it's a great card. It's not a great card. It's a 4 mana 4/4, which is fine. If you can destroy a friendly minion, you will adapt twice. But 2 adaptations.
You are forced to destroy a friendly minion if you play it, yes.
You are forced to destroy it. So if you can destroy one that's like a 2/2 or worse than that, fine, that's good. If you're forced to destroy a 3/3 minion, it's okay-ish maybe. And if you're forced to destroy anything more than a 3/3, that's horrible. So this is it is a card that is not as much of a 4-drop as you might think, because if it kills your 3-drop, it's bad. If you trade your 3-drop and then you play it, it's just a 4 mana 4/4, and it's not that good either. So it's just most uses of it are pretty meh. You can get really good value out of it, but it can also be a situational dead card.
Right. Look, if you have lots of feeding time, or if you have 1/1s, or especially death rattle bodies, or a Devilsaur Egg, right? Oh my gosh, super value
amazing
there. Right. There are those great situations as well, and then you just get a 4 mana 7/7 or 4 mana, Wind Fury, Poisonous Sky or whatever, and it's really, really freaking good. But you always have to remember, for the tier list, it's an average, right? Yeah. And a lot of people are like, "Oh, but I got such good use out of it," and you did. and maybe with your deck it's great, but on the average you are going to have turns in which you can't play this card, and that's
horrible.
Those situations really sink the value. So this is a card in which, like, if you have a deck that is very synergistic, the score could be like off the charts, right? Because if you are almost guaranteed to eat like a 1/1 or like the second body of a Firefly or something, right? That's fantastic. That is so freaking good. But it really is, because of the turns in which you have like a 4/4 body out there, you're just like, I can't do anything.
Yep. Like, in terms of the value, a lot of people are like, oh, you just drop a 2-drop and then you play it and you're fine. You're like barely fine by doing that. That's not that's not a good thing. That's like oh, I've prevented the Pterodax from being awful, like, kind of thing. Like, that's like I saved it. That's not like oh, I got great value out of it, because you could have had a 2-drop on the board, which is probably more stats than you're going to get with the double adapt. And you have used 2 cards instead of 1. Like, there's cost to these things. You can think of a card as -2 mana and -2 health, right? Like, there's cost to these kinds of things. Okay, so that's it for the Warlock. It's bad. You know, nowhere near the Warrior in terms of badness, but it is a bad class, and we're gonna try to make it not suck in our next run. Anything else you want to talk about?
That's it, guys. Go forth with Merps' infallible checklist. Go dominate the arena. Remember how to play around taunts. It's very important. There's lots of taunts. Don't play Warlock. That's it. That's all you need to know. That's
right.
it.
Got 12s, everyone. Until next time, this is Adwicta.
This is Merps. Good luck.